Daniel Avery could tell you, within 4 minutes of meeting someone, exactly what they needed to hear. Not approximately, exactly. The specific word, the precise register, the quality of attention that would make them feel, genuinely, completely feel, that they had been understood by someone worthy. He had been doing it his whole life. He just hadn't always known he was doing it. The first person he ever read was his mother. She was a woman of extraordinary warmth and sudden cold, the kind of person who could fill a room with love on a Tuesday and empty it just as completely on a Wednesday. He learned her the way sailors learn weather, not from instruction, but from survival. The slight tightening around her eyes that meant the cold was coming. The way she hummed while cooking only on the good days. The silence before her worst ones, thick and pressurized, like air before lightning. By 7, he could read her perfectly. By 10, he had extended the skill outward, to teachers, to other children, to the fathers of friends who sat at kitchen tables with the careful stillness of men holding something down. Everyone was broadcasting constantly the precise thing they needed. Most people were too preoccupied with their own broadcasting to receive anyone else's. He received everyone. In return, everyone loved him, or believed they did, which, for a long time, felt like the same thing. By 48, Daniel ran a company of 300 people and a reputation that preceded him into every room. Visionary, decisive, unusually good with people. The kind of leader who remembered your children's names and your professional anxieties and exactly how much pressure you needed to perform at your best. He had built the company from a 2-person consultancy into something that occupied 4 floors of a glass building in the financial district, almost entirely through his understanding of what people needed and his willingness to provide it. His colleagues called it emotional intelligence. His competitors called it instinct. Neither was right. One implies empathy, the other, something unconscious. What Daniel did was entirely deliberate. A continuous calculation running beneath every conversation, every meeting, every handshake. He was never not reading. He was never not adjusting. The performance had been running so long, it had stopped feeling like one. He didn't know what it felt like to not be managing. He had forgotten, if he ever knew. On a Thursday in summer, he sat at the head of a long table and closed a negotiation his team had spent 4 months preparing for. The other party's lead negotiator, a compact, precise woman named Harriet, had entered the room with the contained energy of someone who had decided in advance not to be moved. He read her in the time it took to shake her hand. The slight forward lean, she responded to directness. Eyes going immediately to the documents rather than to him. She trusted data, would mistrust anyone who led with charm. A photograph on her phone's lock screen, glimpsed briefly, a teenage boy. Family was her organizing principle, and anyone who acknowledged that carefully would register as trustworthy. He led with the numbers, and at the moment the tension reached the point where either side would have to yield something, he said, quietly, as though it had just occurred to him, that he had a son about that age. 16. Difficult year. Harriet's shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. They closed within the hour. Driving home, Daniel felt the satisfaction of a mechanism working correctly. He had not lied. He did have a son, 17, currently navigating the difficulty of being his father's child. The detail was true. Its deployment was calculation. He saw no contradiction in that. If you're new here, welcome to Tale Ranch. This is where the human condition is explored through story, tales crafted with care, brought to life through the voice you're hearing now. Subscribe if stories like this one speak to you. Daniel met her at a dinner in October. One of those industry evenings where everyone was wearing faces calibrated for the room. He was good at these, could find the right note for each person without appearing to look for it. He noticed her because she was still. Not quiet, she was talking to the man beside her with complete attention, but still in a way that was unusual in a room full of people managing their impressions. No peripheral awareness of who was watching. No subtle repositioning toward better sightlines. She was simply there, with that man, completely. Her name was Claire, 47. She worked in architectural preservation, had taken time away during her husband's fatal illness, and returned afterward. Daniel made his way to her during a natural pause in her conversation, easy, unhurried, the practiced confidence of a man who has never been wrong about an approach. He introduced himself and smiled, the smile he used when he wanted to seem like a man who didn't use smiles strategically. "What brought you back to the work?" he asked. She said, "Because buildings that have stood for 150 years don't need you to convince them of anything. They're already there. You just have to be honest about what's worth keeping." He had expected something softer, something that performed gratitude for the question. What he couldn't find, what he reached for and could not locate, was what she needed him to be. Every person in that room had a need broadcasting beneath their surface. Recognition, reassurance, validation. Daniel moved through them the way a radio moves through frequencies, automatic, always finding the signal. Claire had no signal. She had something, but it wasn't directed outward. It was simply her, present and complete, requiring nothing from the interaction except the interaction itself. He showed her the face he showed intelligent women who didn't need to be impressed. Thoughtful, slightly restrained, suggesting depth held in reserve. She looked at it with polite interest and then looked away, back to her own conversation, the way you look away from something that doesn't hold your attention. He stood there with the face still on and nowhere to put it. They met again 3 weeks later at a smaller dinner. A man across the table, 50s, well-dressed, the comfortable ease of someone used to being listened to, was talking about a project that had recently stalled. "Honestly," he said, "I think I'm just not cut out for this kind of work anymore. Maybe it's time to let the younger ones have at it." Claire looked at him. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" Not unkindly, just directly, the way you'd point out someone had left their wallet on the table. The man blinked. Then, "No, I don't." She nodded, as if that were the more interesting thing, the truth underneath the joke, and moved on. Daniel watched this and felt something shift. 6 days later, they crossed paths at an opening for a building her firm had restored, a 19th century warehouse converted carefully. She walked him through it with the pride of someone who loves their work, without needing you to love it too. At one point, she stopped before a section of original brick they'd left exposed, raw, unsmoothed, mortar crumbling at the edges. "We had a long argument about this wall," she said. "Half the team wanted to render it, Make it clean. She ran her hand along the surface. I thought the damage was the point. You take that away, and you've got a reproduction, not the real thing. She said it about the wall. He understood she was not only talking about the wall. He tried, each time they met. He listened with complete attention, remembered everything she said, was warm without being excessive, interested without being hungry. She was pleasant. She was genuine. She gave him nothing to work with. Because she wasn't working. There was no gap between what she felt and what she showed. When something interested her, she leaned toward it without editing the lean. When she disagreed, she said so, without the softening architecture people built around disagreement. When she was tired, she said she was tired. She was the most undefended person he had ever met, and he couldn't figure out how to get inside a person with no walls. He asked their mutual colleague about her husband. 3 years. A cancer that moved slowly and then quickly. She had rearranged her entire life around his care without, apparently, needing anyone to notice. Just done it. Come out the other side as though everything had been sorted during those 3 years, into what mattered and what didn't, and the things that didn't had been set down and not picked back up. He felt humbled, not by her loss, by her clarity. He had spent his life on the premise that exposure was the thing to be avoided, that the only safe way to move through the world was behind a face you had chosen. Here was a woman who had been stripped completely by grief, by 3 years of a life reduced to its essentials, and had not been destroyed. She had been clarified. He found this the most frightening thing he had ever encountered. The crack happened on an evening in January. They had fallen into a loose pattern. Dinners with mutual friends, occasional coffees that neither had exactly arranged, but neither had avoided. Daniel told himself he was curious, that she was an interesting case. He was lying. He had become genuinely interested in her, not in what he needed from her, but in what she actually thought, what she actually felt. The distinction was so unfamiliar, it took him weeks to name it. They were the last two at a dinner table, the others having drifted toward the living room. The conversation had gone somewhere he hadn't steered it. "Do you ever get tired of being so good at people?" she asked. He opened his mouth with the response already assembled, self-deprecating, slightly wry, the version of humility that reads as genuine because it knows exactly how genuine reads. And then he didn't say it. He looked at her, at the direct, patient, unperforming way she was waiting, and the answer dissolved. Not because he chose to let it go, because it could not survive her attention. "Yes," he said. "Every day." 2 words. Unmanaged. She looked at him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, just the steady attention she gave everything. "I thought so," she said. Then she picked up her wine glass, looked out at the January street, and gave him a moment to collect himself. It was an act of such quiet, precise kindness that it nearly undone him completely. He drove home in a state he had no name for. The feeling of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just, for 2 seconds, put it down, arms shaking with the sudden absence of the weight. He had been seen, not the constructed version, the actual man who had been wearing effortlessness since the age of 7, and had somewhere forgotten it was a face he'd put on. She had seen that, and she had not looked away, and she had not used it. Daniel pulled back. The oldest reflex he had, going all the way back to the boy who learned that being fully seen was the precondition for being fully hurt. He cancelled 2 engagements where he might have seen her, rebuilt the distance with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. Then he sat in his office one afternoon, the city grey outside his window, and tried to think clearly about his life. He thought about Marcus, his deputy of 11 years, whose loyalty bordered on devotion, who had turned down 2 significant opportunities elsewhere because he couldn't imagine working for anyone else. Daniel had built that loyalty carefully. The right amounts of autonomy and guidance, recognition and challenge. The calibration that kept a talented person feeling both valued and necessary. He thought about Sophie, his ex-wife, who had told him once, near the end, that she felt more known by him than by anyone in her life. She had said it not with gratitude, but with sadness he hadn't understood at the time. He understood it now. She had felt known because he had studied her, learned her fears, her needs, her hungers, and reflected them back so completely that she mistook the reflection for intimacy. 9 years feeling understood by a man who had never once shown her anything real about himself. He thought about Jackson, his son from before Sophie. 17, quiet in the way of boys who already know more than they should, who had said to him last year, "Dad, I never know what you actually think about anything." He had deflected it toward Jackson, his life, his concerns. Jackson had let himself be deflected. But in the moment before, the boy had looked at his father with something Daniel had filed away and not opened since. He opened it now. Grief. His 17-year-old son had looked at him with grief. The grief of someone who loves a person they cannot reach. He sat with that for a long time. The strings ran in both directions. Every relationship he had controlled had shaped him in return. Marcus's loyalty had quietly organized his professional identity. Sophie's love had shown him what he was capable of receiving, not love itself, but the feeling of being loved by someone who didn't truly know him. A warmer and much lonelier thing. Jackson's grief was a mirror. It showed him what he had given his son by giving him nothing real. He had spent his life pulling strings and believed himself free. He was the most controlled person he knew. The puppeteer was also the puppet, had always been. The control was not freedom. It was a cage built from the inside, with no door. Or one door. He knew where it was. Daniel called her on a Wednesday. No strategy. Just the phone in his hand, and the number and the terror of a man about to do something he has no preparation for. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I'd like to have dinner," he said. "Just us. And I'd like to try something I'm not very good at." "What's that?" "Being honest." A pause. The kind a person takes when deciding whether something is real. "All right," she said. They met at a small restaurant she chose, comfortable, not impressive. He arrived first, and sat with his hands on the table, trying to locate the person he actually was. He wasn't sure how far back he had to go. She came in, sat down, looked at him. He told her about his mother. Not everything, just the essential thing. The unpredictability of her love, the child learning to read the room, the discovery that becoming what people needed was a way of making the world manageable, and later, something he enjoyed. He said it plainly. He let it sit between them. She listened without filling the silences, without the reassurances people reflexively offer when someone is being vulnerable. Those small kindnesses that are also underneath a request for the vulnerability to stop. She just received it. How old were you when you realized it worked? 10, maybe 9. She nodded. Then, my husband was the only person I ever met who was completely without pretense. It used to unnerve me. I kept waiting for the version of him that was managing something. It never came. She paused. After he died, I tried to go back to how I used to be. Perform competence when I was frightened. Wear ease when I was anxious. All the arrangements you make between your insides and your face, I found I couldn't. Not because I'd become brave, because it had started to feel absurd. Like speaking a language you've forgotten. The grammar was gone. She looked at her glass. I don't know if that's strength or just damage. Sometimes it feels like both. What do you see, he said, when you look at me? She considered it. Someone very good at giving people what they need. Someone only now beginning to look for a way out of that. And someone who is, right now, more frightened than he's been in a very long time. He looked down at his hands. Yes. The smallest, honest thing. She didn't reach across and take his hand, didn't soften it or rush to fill the space. She simply remained what she was. Present, honest, clear, and let him be frightened without asking him to stop. He thought about Jackson, the grief in his son's eyes, the grief of someone who loves a person they cannot reach. If he couldn't learn this, he would spend the rest of his life watching that grief deepen. Jackson would stop reaching eventually. In anger, perhaps, or just quietly, the way all uncrossed distances finally close. Jackson was 17. There was still time. It was the most honest thought he'd had in years. He didn't know what came next. He hadn't engineered it, hadn't mapped it, hadn't left anything to chance. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he simply didn't know. And sitting there, with his hands on the table, no face left and everything exposed, he found, beneath the terror, beneath the shaking arms, something that felt, distantly, like relief.